If I can begin turning to Emily, could you please just outline why it is that this generation network, 5G, is so different from its predecessors in changing the world as we see it in the future, but also the exposure from a security perspective as well?
5G is the fifth generation of mobile broadband, and it builds on previous generations, 3G, 4G, and so on. But it is a step change in the architecture of the network. So this is a very, very simplified version, but previous generations like 4G have essentially been fairly dumb networks. There is a lot of cleverness involved in managing traffic on the network, but essentially it's about pushing data through to users and making sure that everybody is connected. 5G really changes the way that the network behaves. It embeds software into the core of the network so that it can be much more responsive to demand. Say you might have a massive event in a stadium and many, many tens of thousands of people gathered together at one stage. Instead of the network failing, it could scale up to support that sort of demand and then scale back down again. So it's going to be much more dynamic. It will enable a lot of things that we have been looking forward to and perhaps dreading with our security hats on. It would be a great enabler of the so-called Internet of Things. Things like smart devices, driverless cars, smart cities, smart water systems, and power grids. So there will be a lot more infrastructure, because you'll be operating at much, much higher speeds. And that means that there will be a lot more masts and antennae visible to us. They're talking about one on every street lamp type of frequency. But there will also be a lot more devices connected to the mobile network. So in the past generations, like 4G and 3G, the types of devices that you connect are fairly predictable. They're usually phones. But now we're going to have all sorts of things. And we know from our study of the so-called Internet of Things, these smart devices, that often a lot of them are sadly built with very, very poor cybersecurity. So you'll be having a lot more things connecting to the network and with a range of cybersecurity abilities, if you like. And our reliance on that network is going to be great. And we all know that where there is great reliance, there is also risk involved, because if those things fail or if they're compromised, then the impact of that failure is all the greater.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to you both. Perhaps, Emily, if I could direct this question to you in the first instance. You talked about the spectrum, I guess, of devices and uses for which 5G will have. Is that where the inherent security vulnerability comes? Could you give us a sense of, from a security perspective, the distinct differences? Perhaps it is the software embedded you mentioned, but the distinct differences from a security perspective of 5G as compared to 4 and 3G?
So there are several layers of concern when we look at 5G, or really any network that's so big and so relied upon. Yes, you're absolutely right. The type of devices, the number of devices that will connect to them, and their characteristics. You know, a lot of smart devices, for example, baby cameras, have been involved in major cyber attacks because a lot of devices that are fairly straightforward and simple are poorly secured and easily compromised. So that is one area, the type of devices, the number of devices. But then, as you mentioned, the type of network itself and the way that it is changing from a more static network to something that is dynamic and software driven, that is virtualized. That means that it's, you know, anywhere where you have software, and I work with software programmers, software contains errors because it's made by humans and there's millions and millions of lines of it and nothing is perfect. Software contains errors, and those errors can form vulnerabilities that are exploited by adversaries. Also, in very high level terms, where you have complexity, it's much more difficult to guarantee security. Nobody would claim that you could ever guarantee 100% security, but there are, with 5G, you have layers of concerns. It's the devices, the nature of the network, the physical safety of the equipment. This is something that we've seen in recent days and weeks with the concern, the debunked theory that 5G was in some way causing coronavirus, and we started to see actual infrastructure being vandalized. And so we can often forget about physical security when we're thinking very much in cyber, but that is another aspect. The management of all of these networks requires a lot of sophistication. So you have a management layer for the network, which itself, if it is, say, connected to the internet, accessible by adversaries, that could be another entry point. Now, with any security issues, you can end up sort of running away with the concerns, but I think we all need to also bear in mind the context of what 5G can bring to our economies and our lives. Here we are meeting virtually in the context of a complete lockdown because of a different type of security, a public safety concern. And the internet and technology is enabling us to have some kind of normality, some kind of economy as this pandemic rages. And so while we should be concerned about security and national security when it comes to 5G, we should also bear in mind the context of what it can bring, what it can enable, and some things like environmental benefits that could flow from the smart management of resources.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, both. I have a question of two parts. Emily, you spoke about security risk and adversaries. Huawei, a high-risk vendor, has stated that they have developed a new robust security framework for telecoms, supported by the National Cyber Security Centre's risk mitigation model and based upon the government's new telecom security requirements. Now, are we to take reassurance from this, given that Chinese law has recently, in 2017, established that the state can compel companies to assist with intelligence?
Thank you for that question. So one of the approaches that I think that the British intelligence services have taken to Huawei throughout its experience with Huawei in the UK, which has gone back to 2003, is one of risk management. Huawei has always been considered to be a high-risk vendor. It has always been considered that whatever any of the parties say, Chinese law and practice would require the handing over, reflected, as you said, in China. That as you put in your question, national law in China requires operators to share data with the government. So the approach of the National Cybersecurity Centre has always been to assume that those things would or could take place. However, Huawei is here in the infrastructure. It is here in 4G. And has been since 2003. And so the approach has been one of risk mitigation, of risk management, to ensure that our people understand how the equipment is working, what its vulnerabilities and flaws are. And the 2019 annual report that came out from the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre made pretty grim reading for that. Huawei clearly has a long distance to travel before the quality of its software and its cybersecurity practices are deemed to be satisfactory. Those reports highlighted serious and systemic risks in its software and its cybersecurity practices. So while Huawei has made promises of significant investment, billions of dollars, in updating its software core and resolving some of those concerns, it still has some way to go. But I think that the evidence-based pragmatic approach that has been taken in this country, particularly over the last 10 years, is something that, none of us live in a perfect world. It's the classic looking for directions and saying, well, I wouldn't start from here. There aren't enough competitors in the market. Even if you decided today, I don't want Huawei in this country, what are you going to do about all the 4G infrastructure that they are providing? How do you manage that risk? And so it is about just taking evidence-based steps and making sure that this country is reasonably satisfied that it understands the equipment that is being put into the ground, and that the cybersecurity practices are in focus, along with all of the other elements that come together in purchasing decisions. None of us do know the future, and we can, all we can do is to try to prepare for it and try to make sure that we're as well informed as possible. I think that this country's Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre is a good step. It's a welcome step. It's not perfect. It's been criticised in the past. Its governance has been improved in the last few years so that it is accountable directly to the National Cybersecurity Centre. But yes, we don't know when 6G and the successive generations of mobile broadband will arrive, or what they will look like when they do. And so I think that, when we're looking at how to build out the network and to guarantee or to benefit from the social and economic benefits that new, faster connections in mobile will bring, we have to look at the vendors. As Andre said, there is a real problem in the lack of competition for vendors, and I hope we'll be exploring that in more detail in future questions. But we also, building out national infrastructure does require the ability to meet the demands of scale. A startup, however, sorry.
But building out the kit, you say that Huawei's here anyway, therefore we've got to work with them. And again, that flies in the face of the Australian Security Signals Agency, the Americans, all of whom saying we don't know what it's going to look like, we can't actually deliver these guarantees. But when you say the kit's here, if I understand correctly, and this is a technical issue, and I understand why some of your answers are more political interpretation, which is great, but you can build somebody out of a network over a 4 to 8 year period when that network is effectively replaced anyway. And indeed, much of the software is going to be replaced on an almost continual basis. So building out a high risk supplier, and again, high risk is the phrase here, building out a high risk supplier can be done reasonably efficiently over a 5 to 8 year period. So then that brings back the question, if other suppliers like Ericsson, like Nokia in France, like Fujitsu in Japan, Samsung in Korea, if they can build these networks and they are low risk contractors, why take the option of a high risk contractor unless it is fundamentally for political reasons?
Well, whether or not it's for political reasons, as you said in your question, Mr. Seeley, Huawei is here anyway. And so even if we took the decision, well, 5G is not going to involve Huawei at all, then because 5G technically will sit on top of existing infrastructure, you're going to have to manage that high risk vendor in the existing networks at the moment and for the, at least for the medium term. Yes, you're quite right that as technology improves, then the infrastructure will need to be repaired, replaced, and upgraded. And as you said in your question, with a software-driven core, possibly a lot of that enhancement can take place through upgrades in a sort of virtual way as we upgrade, the software core. But there was one thing in your question, your statement, that I just wanted to come back to, which is that the situation of the US and Australia, which, as you say, have done outright bans of Huawei and ZTE. Now, they're coming from a different base layer. So they enacted bans on Huawei in 2012. And so their existing infrastructure is not nearly as dependent on Huawei as ours is. And therefore they are, if you like, more free to maneuver. However, everybody in the world has got the problem of not many competitors to choose from in this market. And if you take the approach, it's a bit like saying, this operator is high risk, is not secure, and therefore another operator or another set of equipment is secure. We've heard from Andre and others that this is going to be a very difficult network to secure because of its complexity, because of the reliance on it. But also, if you choose to exclude one of three potential vendors, then you're starting to create security risks because what if one of those two last vendors fails? What if their stuff it doesn't deliver on the security that you would want it to?
Isn't the answer to that?
Well, we're going to have to make some progress. Apologies about that. Richard, do you want to come in? And then Alicia, I'll hand to you, and then you can go into your question as well. Richard.
Emily and Andre, good morning to you both, and thank you for coming. Just quickly to clarify to, I think, many, Emily, how would it be possible to remove Huawei entirely from our existing network, or how much could we remove now if we so chose to do so, and how far behind are we to get an alternative that would be more vendor-friendly to the West in place?
Well, anything is possible, and so Huawei, for example, is present in some rural areas in the United States, and the United States is talking about a so-called rip and replace type of strategy. We've heard that Huawei provides a lot of infrastructure in this country at the moment. So the rip and replace would not just be for a small rural area. It would have to go throughout the country, and that will be costly, and it will take a lot of time. Now, of course, anything is possible. It depends on how the risk is balanced. But technology markets, they're not just first mover advantage. The first mover tends to be a winner takes all. And the risk to the country, if we decide, well, actually, we're so unhappy with the idea of a high-risk vendor being in our infrastructure, despite the fact that that vendor has been in our infrastructure for the past 15 years. So we're so unhappy that we are just going to delay our 5G until we have got every single last bit of Chinese equipment out of the country. That will bring economic and social risks. It will also delay, we're a very innovative country. We have a very innovative tech sector. We're not so great at making the world-beating tech giants, but those industries will also be impacted by a delay in building out 5G. So I think that there are pros and cons of all of these things. And also, I think although Huawei has a lot of attention, and rightly so, it's not the case that they are Chinese and no other technology supply chain involves China. When you dig into most technology supply chains, you find China. And so if you're going to make national security type of decisions solely based on the flag of the vendor, you're going to have to do a lot of digging into this, right back into the supply chains and all of the manufacturing of all of your vendors, and try to root out China. So it's not a sort of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad type of equation. And I think that often Huawei is a lightning rod for justifiable concerns about how comfortable do we feel about a technical world order where China is the superpower and not the US, and with all of the Western values that are embedded in its technologies. We're going to have to face up to that. And I think that the approach that the UK has taken to date, which is just quite evidence-based, and to sort of go, well, let's make sure that we understand what sort of equipment we're putting into the ground, and that as far as possible we manage those risks, because it's not, Russia has conducted cyber attacks on our mobile infrastructure. As far as I know, it didn't provide any of the equipment. You don't need to provide equipment in order to compromise it. And we are living all the time with cyber attacks from bad actors. Some of them are state-sponsored, some are not. And it's going into flaws in software. It's going into complexity, into poorly secured devices. And so we have to take a holistic view of the cybersecurity of this network, and understand it's never going to be completely secure, but think about our resilience and think about managing that risk in the best practical way possible.
Okay.
No, not in particular. I think it highlights that regardless of whether it's 1 point or 4 points, any access provides an opening, as Emily said earlier. Once you have access to one thing, you will mole your way through to find access to others.
And that is the difference between 5G, I think, and 4G. Emma, I think, wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think that, yes, to an extent. So if you compromise any device, so if your printer at home gets compromised, that compromise will flow through to any access on your network that the printer enjoys. And so part of the design of any network, particularly a national network, would be to bear in mind that any compromise should only go so far and not create a systemic failure. And I think that the debates around where the core and the edge begin and end are very key to this debate. And so you have Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia, saying the core is no more with 5G. But the way, as I understand it, the National Cybersecurity Centre are approaching the core versus the access layer or edge, is that they're saying, well, while you may theoretically take the core, the intelligent bit, the brains of the system, right out to the edge, to the antennae, why would you ever want to do that? That's going to create a huge physical security headache for you as a network operator. And where these antennae go wrong or are vandalized, that's going to create massive vulnerability. And so the National Cybersecurity Centre is saying, yes, while in theory the two may blend, in practice they're not going to, for lots and lots of really good reasons. And therefore, it is safer to keep a high-risk vendor out of the brains of the network, and it is feasible and plausible to do so in a way of managing risk.
Emily, you have said that everywhere if you look deep enough, you can find China. Is there anything in Nokia and Ericsson where we would find China, and anything in their supply chain or setup of their infrastructure that would be the 2017 international law in China would be pertinent to them as well?
Thank you, Stuart. Ericsson has a very long history of relationship with China. It's been established in China since the 1890s and has a 50% market share in mobile communications, 10% of fixed networks in China. Its Nanjing factory is that offers, according to Ericsson's literature, the most advanced manufacturing facilities in the world, producing 5G and 4G radio technology products, most of which supports providers in China, most. And in Jiangsu, there's a Robotechnic project with China Mobile, providing 5G smart manufacturing. Nokia, with its FAW group, is providing 5G trail network for joint research on 5G and smart connected cars in China, and it cooperates with that FAW to develop 5G network slicing, which is going to be really important as 5G really takes off in the future. And it uses facilities in China to make and assemble equipment for the US 5G market.
So just a quick clarification, with the infrastructure that they've got in China, would they also fall under that 2017 international law?
Well, my understanding of the 2017 law is that it covers critical communications providers established in China, and so to that extent, I think that would be my understanding. It's not something that I have looked into deeply.
Thank you.
But Andre probably has more on that.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, Emily and Andre. As we know, the UK government has decided to limit Huawei to non-core functions and to cap it at 35%. What do you personally think of that decision, Emily?
That the UK had very little room for manoeuvre given the reality of its 4G infrastructure and its long-standing relationship with Huawei, that it also had a very difficult line to walk between managing this high-risk vendor and also managing its relationship with key allies, and notably the Five Eyes, who had the US and Australia have been extremely vocal in their opposition to using Huawei. And so it was clear that the UK didn't have the same flexibility to just get rid of Huawei in the way that was open to US and Australia, did not want to really compromise the Five Eyes and other relationships. We had a situation where the Secretary of State and the President were making overt statements to say that they would have to limit intelligence sharing with allies who chose Huawei. So what do you do? And I think that the compromise position, it was clear that this was reached with some reluctance. We were waiting for that decision for nearly a year. Meanwhile, the operators had started their commercial rollouts of 5Gs in some cities in the UK. And it's really trying to walk a very thin line, which is how do you manage Huawei given that it currently has a large market share in the UK? How do you convince your allies that you're not just going to be opening up the intelligence of your network to potentially a foreign adversary? And how do you make sure that you're not delaying or imposing cost on mobile operators who have not been as profitable in the last decade as their software counterparts? As Andre said, software companies, the US giants, have been making profits in the last 10 years, which really eclipse those of the mobile operators. So it's not like, well, the mobile operators have got tons of money and they can just afford to dig up all existing infrastructure. So that it was a very constrained decision. And I think it was the least worst outcome.
Okay. And Andre, what do you think? Do you think it was a sensible decision?
Tana, I think it was in our context in the UK, it was quite a dramatic intervention into the marketplace. Historically, we've had an open market in the UK with very few red lines for foreign investors of any kind. And historically, our government has spent very little time scrutinizing the national security risks associated with foreign investment. And so for the UK government to make an intervention where they very clearly draw a red line around a particular foreign investor, very clearly state that they will not allow this foreign investor to increase its market share in the UK. I think in the context of how open our economy was, this was a very significant intervention.
Okay. Well, look, for a layperson like myself, can you explain, please, the significance of 35%, or is that just a random number plucked out of the air? Emily?
My understanding is that it's quite close to Huawei's current market share. And it also, we talked about the different segments of the network. The chair highlighted the transition layer, the core or the brains of the network, the access layer, and also the management system. Now, so the antennae, the masts, so Andre and I, in our earliest statements, talked about how the infrastructure, the visible infrastructure is going to be really, really great. You know, so we're going to have lots and lots of tiny antennae everywhere, like street lamps, everywhere you could place it, because the range of these 5G signals is much lower than its predecessor technologies. So given that the physical equipment at the edge is going to be a lot greater, that kind of the figure of 35% is consistent with that decision to say, well, Huawei can provide that kind of layer along with others, okay, but not the core.
Firstly, just to go back slightly, a question to you, Emily, when you mentioned the balancing act of not compromising the United Kingdom's relationship with Five Eyes countries. Can I ask you, to what extent do you think that that relationship has been compromised? Just to kind of speculate, based on your own expertise, will the relationship change going forward because of the decision that the UK government has made? And kind of following on from that, when the government announced the 35% cap, it actually said it would cap it at 35% and tried to get the market share down. And I wonder if I could ask both witnesses, what kind of percentage do they think that the government can reasonably expect to get it down to, and over what timescale?
So to address your first point, to what extent has this decision compromised the strength of the Five Eyes relationship, the vital intelligence sharing alliance with the US and other allies? It's very hard to know. It's the first time I've ever come across one member of the Five Eyes essentially threatening others over purchasing decisions of equipment. So you've got pretty consistent and overt statements being made by very high-level members of the administration saying intelligence sharing will have to be limited. And that's not just a one-off statement. It's been repeated by the Secretary of State. It's been repeated by the President and other officials. But that hasn't quite caused the sort of shockwaves I would have expected among, you know, from my conversations with members of those communities, because the relationships they view as extremely strong. They're very long lasting. They're often on a personal level and go back decades. And this raises an interesting issue. Why aren't the intelligence services more worried about it, given that the political statements are so binary? And does this, you know, so it's either a real threat, in which case we should all be worried. And I think the US should be worried, because the US is not, the UK rather, is not just a recipient of information in that network. It is a contributor of information as well. And so everybody's going to end up a bit less secure if that relationship is compromised. But so they either mean it or they don't mean it. If they don't mean it, why are they saying it? But also, if the political masters can say one thing and the intelligence services just carry on doing what they did before, that to me also highlights a whole other issue and a whole other questions of accountability and who everybody's answering to.
Is that okay, Stuart?
Yeah, and on the 35% share, the government saying they wanted to get that down.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that's realistic, and if so, over what kind of timescale and to what percentage can we expect?
I know Andre wants to come in on this just very quickly before he does. I think it is realistic, and what I'm hearing from colleagues who've connections with the mobile operators is that some of them are already actively starting to minimise their use of Huawei in new purchasing decisions for existing, or also trying to get their networks throughout the European Union to a similar layer, or getting Huawei out of core. So I think it may be that the market does its own thing. I hope we come back to the market. Andre raised some really interesting points about that and where the market doesn't deliver security. But I know Andre wanted to come in on this point, so please.
Stuart, on your question about the Five Eyes relationship, of course, the Five Eyes relationship and Britain's role as a leading as a country that has some of the most leading and innovative intelligence services in the world have been long established, and these are very deep relationships of trust. However, having said that, I think we should not underestimate the strength of feeling in Washington on this issue. China has changed its positioning in the world. Under Xi Jinping, it's made clear that it aims to become the leading country in the world, and that in becoming the leading country in the world, it will impose new standards and new behaviors on the international system. And this decision by the Chinese Communist Party continues to reverberate into every aspect of our lives. As a result, Washington has reassessed its relationship with China, and all the debate and discussion which we're currently having about Huawei is part of that reassessment. And it's as much driven by the new geopolitical realities of China's determination to be the ascendant power in the world as it is by the implications of new areas of technology. So in Washington, there's a very broad bipartisan consensus that China is using every means at its disposal in its ascendant strategy, including its ability to reach into our societies through its telecommunications providers. And this is a very strong bipartisan consensus politically, and that's why someone like Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker in Congress, have spoken out about this issue and have made statements about this issue. But it's also a view that's very strongly held in the US national security community. And we shouldn't underestimate the level of conviction and the strength of feeling on this issue. And that there's a very clear view that this poses a threat not only to national security interests, but also poses a threat to issues we care about very deeply, like human rights, like the treatment of minorities, and could pose a threat to democracy and other democratic values that we hold dear.
Thank you for that. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. The discussions around the 35% periphery presence sort of raises concerns about the ambiguity of the delineation between core and periphery. Now, taking you back to my original point about China's National Intelligence Law of 2017, the NCSC have excluded high-risk vendors, Huawei, from nuclear sites and military bases. Now, just to take you to a grassroots example, how much confidence do you have that the use of Huawei mobile technology, for example, by contractors in Faz Lane, that technology won't be able to access sensitive data?
Emily, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so the difference between the core and the periphery is at the heart of your question. And my understanding is that Huawei has always been excluded from highly sensitive networks, and it will be excluded from operating the brains of 5G. So the question is then, if you're anywhere on the network providing equipment, does this pose a security threat? Two things on that. I think that while in theory, the intelligent brains of the 5G network could extend right to the edge where people interact with the network, in practice it won't, and that there is a ring around it which you could plausibly describe as the periphery, as non-core, if you like. And then there is, whether or not you should be trusting Huawei to be part of the network in any case. I think that it comes back to a sort of, well, they are here already. And the approach so far has been one of risk management. To me, it's quite significant that despite the strength of feeling that Andre described among, bipartisan at the political layer in the United States, we have not really been given real concrete examples of, in practice, Huawei overstepping the line. And while, for example, the 2019 Huawei Cybersecurity Center report was extremely critical about the quality of Huawei's software and its cybersecurity practices. I mean, Dr. Ian Levy of the NCSC has called it shoddy. They went out of their way in that same report to say, we see no evidence of collusion with the Chinese state. And I would expect our intelligence services that we've all spoken very highly about here to really be at the cutting edge of that knowledge. If there was really this fire hose of data going. I'm not saying, because we haven't found it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, okay? The risk is clearly there. But given the long standing of the relationship, we also can look back on the history to date and see what has occurred. So that should give us some measure. If we're not happy, we can be a little bit, less concerned about it, perhaps. Also, I think it's really worth emphasizing that you don't have to provide a network in order to compromise it. Andre has spoken about China's track record as conducting hostile cyber attacks, primarily the theft of intellectual property, but also other cyber attacks, and we can anticipate it in the future. Now, the ability, the capability, and the will to do that is not necessarily completely tied with being an equipment provider or having links with an equipment provider. Unfortunately, the market has not delivered good cybersecurity practices throughout the ecosystem. And this is a major, major problem that we have to face up to as societies. The market actually rewards companies for being less secure and not more secure. And so as long as those market conditions persist, it will always be possible for hostile state actors to compromise our systems, whether or not they provide them. Russia does not provide, as far as I know, any core equipment in networks in this country, and yet it has conducted attacks on our networks. So yes, we need to be aware of the cybersecurity risks and manage it, but it does not follow that providing, being a provider in the network necessarily means a greater cybersecurity risk, because the levels of cybersecurity are so low, unfortunately, that it is possible for states and bad actors to exploit vulnerabilities in any event. Huawei has made substantial investments in research and development, and this can be seen as part of China's Made in China 2025 strategy to go from being an imitator to an innovator, particularly in technology. And it also Huawei had 19% growth in revenue during 2019. And when you consider all the things that happened to Huawei during 2019, that is quite remarkable. Huawei has signed 90 commercial contracts for 5G around the world, and says that it has shipped more than 600,000 base stations. That compares with Nokia's 69 commercial contracts in 20 countries and Ericsson's 89 commercial contracts, 31 live networks and across 17 countries. So Huawei's doing well, so are others. It's shipping a lot of kit. It's investing a lot more in research and development than its competitors are able to do. And this goes to the remarks that Andre was making about the conditions in which Huawei is operating. And there are two elements that I would like to just add to those thoughts. One is that Huawei's China's role in the Belt and Road Initiative and technology equipment's role as part of the currency of the Belt and Road. China has been extremely generous in building out networks in Africa. And when we see there is never any such thing as a free lunch. When those countries get into difficulties, we start to see the strategy revealed. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, when Sri Lanka was having trouble repaying debts, China assumed shares in a strategic port as part of debt forgiveness. Mexico was offered a very generous loan on 1% interest on the condition that 80% of it was spent with Huawei. So we see that technology build out is very much forming part of the Belt and Road strategy, a patient, sustained strategy that has been conducted over decades. And I would also like to highlight that China is extremely active in technical standards, particularly through the United Nations. And it is putting significant resources into multiple study groups. And this should also be a wake-up call to countries that have been relying on the market to sort these things out, that investment, that consistency, that level of participation in the technical standards bodies, particularly in the United Nations, has to be backed up by countries that have perhaps a different vision of the future networks and the communication systems.
John, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Can I just probe that a bit further, though? Is the kit actually any better? Because when I speak to Ericsson and other operators, they actually just say they market themselves better. There's this myth that goes around Parliament, the debates that we had here, that they are 6 months, a year ahead in their technology capabilities. Ericsson dispute that. They simply make the kit far cheaper. And it's the price attraction which overrides any capability. Would you agree with that? Emily?
I think that's right. You know, the price point is very, very attractive. And that's my understanding as well. And you also have the assessments that have been made independently of Huawei's kit, which is that it is not of the highest quality. Now, what we are lacking is that independent public assessment of all of the operators' equipment, and then we would be able to make side-by-side comparisons. Huawei has always been treated differently and has higher levels of scrutiny. That's really useful, and it in fact means that Huawei has to lay open things that other companies wouldn't normally naturally do unless they were compelled to do so. is Huawei an intellectual leader to your two premises? No. However, it is attractive on price, but there is also a benefit in having vendor diversity in a highly consolidated market, and therefore, there's a point where having a lack of diversity in your equipment provision creates its own security risks. Number two, no option but to Huawei. Yes and no. Obviously, you can build out your 5G network with other vendors. The reality in the UK is that the early 5G development will be sitting on top of existing 4G. Huawei is very present in our 4G infrastructure. So unless you want to rip out and replace existing infrastructure, you're stuck with Huawei for the foreseeable future. But just on the point of looking to the future, I think we've done a lot of how did we get to where we are and isn't it terrible? But looking to the future, I would just like to build on Andre's remarks about the need to shake up this equipment provision market. And there is actually exciting work going ahead and a lot of investment going ahead, particularly to create this so-called open RAN, which is to sort of really have interoperable equipment which could prevent that sort of vendor lock-in that we're all sitting here worrying about what to do about. And there is significant investment going into open RAN startups. In the UK, there have been some trials and also in other countries. And this would potentially drive prices right down and give entry points for new vendors into the market, which is very much needed. And just a last point, because I know you want to come in again, the role of software in the 5G environment will also potentially bring in very, very capable vendors into the mobile broadband market. For example, some of the major cloud providers. I wouldn't run away with the idea that those faults are deliberately placed in it. Don't forget that Huawei is also providing equipment in other markets such as China. A vulnerability, and in cybersecurity, the worst example is when you create a vulnerability and then it's used against you. A vulnerability can be used against anybody who is using the equipment, including the home team, if you like. I think that one of the major failings in the market is that software companies are just not rewarded in any way for having secure practices and thoroughly testing their software. The market doesn't reward it. The market rewards getting out to market quickly, doing things cheaply, and having lots and lots of features. Huawei started life as an equipment manufacturer, and we're starting to see this more and more as the Internet of Things comes on stream. We work with the Internet of Things Security Foundation, and there you have people who've spent their entire careers making stuff, meeting people who are building software. It's a complete culture clash. People who are in manufacturing have secure processes and have very highly mechanized processes that they can repeat and that they have documented. Software just is a much more agile, much more scrummy, much more messy world. And I think that one of the things that policymakers really need to focus on is how do you, if you can't rely on the market to create the incentives you need to raise the levels of cyber hygiene and good practice, then what is the role of regulation in doing that? Because we can't go on with the situation we have with buggy software. We know about Huawei's bugs because they lay open their code. Other software providers don't do that.
Emily, is it not the case, though, that we've got no way of ascertaining whether the equipment and approach they take with their domestic product differs from that which they export and differs from the individuals they send in the last 10 days of an installation of a Huawei product, that we are not allowed to interrogate or to ascertain what they are doing to that product?
No, you make an extremely valid point. I think that's totally right.
Chairman, Open RAN, Emily and Andre, could you just explain to people like myself and many watching this session, I suspect, exactly what is Open RAN, which I understand is a virtualized 5G introduced by a Japanese online giant. We've heard you say that the virtualized 5G would not be so reliant on one vendor. So how is that going to help us break free of Huawei if it could in the future?
So the idea of open radio access network technology is that it would provide commoditized hardware into the 5G market. So the main thing about commoditized hardware would be, number one, is cheaper. Number two, it's interoperable, so you don't have the vendor lock-in. Are you a Huawei house or an Ericsson house, that these bits of kit would all talk to each other openly, and that would expand the supplier options beyond the traditional players that we've seen. And so it's a great opportunity for innovation and for new players to enter the market. So Vodafone have been investing in this technology, so have Telefonica. So the work is ongoing, trials are ongoing, the reports are positive about it. And so, as we look to the future, we obviously have to understand how we got here, why that wasn't perhaps optimal in many ways, but we also have to look to the future with excitement about the opportunities that it could bring to diversify the supply chain. I think we really are where we are because we don't have a diversified supply chain. The alternatives are very costly. And so where people are making resource-constrained decisions about investment, they're choosing the cheapest option in some way. And so I feel quite excited about Open RAN as a potential way out of the situation we're in, and of course where you do have software really embedded into a network in a way that we haven't seen before, there are all sorts of possibilities that we probably haven't thought of for innovation and new players to join in that market.
Emily, just forgive me, sorry, but again, being a novice, would this new system, the Open RAN, would that negate the need for masts on every street? I would be more reliant on software than hardware. Have I misunderstood that?
No, I don't think it would negate the need for masts on every street, because part of the way that the 5G technology works is it's operating on very high bandwidths in the spectrum. So, in very high frequencies, and that means it can't transmit as far. You can't have a kind of like a mega base station that's just operating on a wide area. The range of each of these devices, these antennae, will be much lower. And so you're still going to need a lot of stuff. It's who provides it, how much it costs, and whether it works with other people's stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and to both witnesses, and I think they'll probably agree with the question. I'm just looking for some practical answers as to how the UK government can take steps to practically increase the numbers of vendors in the UK, and then maybe a couple of follow-ups to that.
So part of what the UK government can do to proactively increase the number of vendors is to encourage the kind of investment in new technologies that Andre and I have both been talking about, and also to work very closely with the mobile operators who are actually making the purchasing decisions, as they do. I do feel that while we all like to criticise government and the arms of state, the management of the Huawei issue has been quite well done in the UK. It's been evidence-based, and cautious. And so I think that looking to the future, there is definitely a need for more vendor diversity. And, you know, to Bob Seeley's point, Huawei wouldn't be the first incumbent to resist open technologies. For me, as an internet person coming into the world of mobile telecoms, the internet in a way was originally created to prevent a lot of the vendor lock-in, the sort of the throttling by patents and intellectual property that besets the telecommunications market. So introducing interoperability, open standards, it does a lot for encouraging, fostering innovation, competition, and also, you know, a lot more transparency, a lot less black box, and a lot more scrutiny. However, you know, I would be the first person to say that the internet is not trouble-free. And so it just replaces, in some cases, one set of problems with a different set of problems, but that's life, isn't it? Yeah. And whatever the arrangements that are in place for trade arrangements and our relationship with Europe and the rest of the world, technology markets are inherently global. The supply chains we've been talking about this morning are global in nature. And so it's up to policymakers to ensure that those markets are kept as open as possible and that there aren't additional barriers put in place as a result of these changes that further inhibit competition or that inhibit intelligence sharing. So our intelligence sharing networks with the Five Eyes is really important to national security, but so is our intelligence sharing with European partners. And in a lot of ways, our telecommunications markets are more similar to European partners than they are to the United States. So there are many challenges ahead after we emerge from this pandemic. And I would just like to echo what Andre said about the role of the intelligence services keeping us safe, and particularly decrying the cyber attacks against healthcare institutions during the pandemic. But it just highlights how vulnerable many of our systems are, particularly in the non-technology sectors such as healthcare. Healthcare was also massively affected by the WannaCry cyber attack in 2017 as well. So whatever the challenges ahead, it's up to policymakers to ensure that the markets are kept as open as possible and that investment still flows, particularly into new and emerging technologies.
Maybe share your thoughts on the direction of travel. What is China's agenda here, given they're growing technologically, militarily, and economically more superior every single day? Huawei is just one part of that factor.
For the last 2 decades, we have become accustomed to US dominance in technology markets. And this has led to an idea or even complacency that technological standards and technology is neutral, because for us, the values, the sort of attitudes of the people who build the technology are fairly similar to our own, and they flow through into things that are open, interoperable, and support freedom of expression and fundamental rights. China is quite clearly well down a path where its ambition is one of international technical dominance. And there we will all have to cope with standards, technologies, and equipment created by a superpower that does not share our values. Technology is not neutral, and we really have to confront this when it comes to China being the world leader. Of course, Chinese ambitions in this sphere are, in a way, aided by the fact that at the moment the US is a rather erratic partner at times, and is sort of, in a way, ceding that international space to another party. But if you want to look ahead at what China has in store for us, do take a close look at what's going on in international standards development, and in particular China's development of so-called new IP, in which Huawei plays an active and central role, which would be a fundamental re-architecting of the way that the internet works in ways which we can expect to benefit Chinese political ambitions.
The concern I have there, though, is that if China is to become a world, an ever more dominant world leader, and but it's developing its own standards, and as you say, the West is not united in perhaps challenging those standards, it's become risk averse. There is a worry as to the direction of travel where this takes us to. It's almost a split, if you like, in world standards, where China benefits from rules-based order, which are eroding all the time. It doesn't want to assume the responsibility of a superpower, knowing that it can't honor the standards that superpowers should be upholding for the benefit of the rest of the world.
If I may just very quickly respond to that, yes, I agree. And I think that while the West, I agree with your characterization, the West has not been as proactive or on the ball on this as it should have been. But probably when push comes to shove, the West would oppose that sort of splintering, if you like. Where I see the main risk area is in developing countries, in recipients of Chinese aid, of technology, of the Belt and Road, where you're getting this equipment for free or not having the equipment at all. And if it comes with certain characteristics, or if it carries with it certain ways of behaving, then, well, what's the choice really? And I think that this is where the West has to step up to think about, well, what is the alternative offer and what is the strategy? Because those countries will determine whether or not we continue on the same network.